Welcome to Office Hours with Peter Hannick. In this episode, I'd like to discuss a question that I'm probably asked more than any other question, and that is, what can and should we do to reform the police in the United States? This question has been asked, it's a never-ending question. If you look at the history of police in the United States has always been a history of reform. History of attempting to change things and improve things and alter the way we do things. But this question has gained increased frequency and increased currency in the past few years since a series of high-profile deaths, specifically of young black men, starting with Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Eric Garner, and then most recently, obviously, George Floyd. And the question is, what should we do? And there are reforms that are proposed. There's a huge number of reforms that have been proposed, and I'm going to discuss many of them today. But I want to begin by kind of laying my cards on the table. As a policing scholar, I am a skeptic. I'm a skeptic specifically of reform. I'm a skeptic of training, and I'm a skeptic of the idea that we can make tweaks around the margins and change really the way policing functions. Now, I will also say that I am not a police abolitionist. I'm going to discuss what that perspective is in a little bit. But I'm not saying that we should get rid of the police. But I do think we need a fundamental rethinking of the way police functions in the United States. So, to begin with, the basic idea, my big point, my big takeaway, the one that I really want to emphasize, is that if we attempt to make piecemeal reforms, making these tweaks, making adjustments around the margins, without altering the fundamental dynamics of how police interact with citizens in the United States, we're not really going to change anything. We're not really going to be fixing anything. And in fact, the biggest takeaway, and one that I'm going to come back to at the end, is the idea that if we do make these series of adjustments and tweaks, what we'll have done is really spent an opportunity, right? An opportunity we could have used to make more fundamental and long-lasting, and I would argue, more effective changes. So let's start with some of the big ones. One of the biggest proposals to change the police has come from under the hashtag 8can'twait. And this is a series of 8 proposals that have been kind of a grouping of 8 proposals that have been widely adopted by many police departments around the country. So I want to talk about each of those 8 and what they represent and what they mean, and why I think they might be a good idea, or why I think there might be problems with the way that they're described. So let's go through these proposals one at a time. The first proposal is to ban strangleholds and chokeholds. On face, this seems like a great idea. You might say, well, why is this a problem? Of course, that's a good idea. But the problem is if you assume that banning them will mean that they won't be used, or banning them will solve a problem. So the most high-profile case that I think might be relevant would be that of the death of Eric Garner. So if you recall, Eric Garner was killed in Staten Island by a New York City police officer. And the police officer used a chokehold. And that's what ultimately led to Eric Garner's death, even though the New York City Police Department had banned the use of chokeholds. So this first question of, well, is banning enough? Well, obviously banning's not enough, because when the New York City Police Department banned them, what happened? They were still used. And they're still used in this very high-profile case. But beyond that, we look to see, well, what happened? Well, what happened, the officer responsible for Eric Garner's death was not prosecuted. No charges were brought. While there was a wrongful death suit that brought against the city, this is kind of standard practice for police departments. They, in fact, have usually funds set aside to cover these wrongful death suits. And it doesn't really change anything about their behavior. Likewise, the federal government declined to bring charges. While it is true that the officer was ultimately terminated 5 years after the incident, this question of, well, was the ban enough? I think that the conclusion would be no, by itself, the ban is not enough. Now, obviously, the argument is it's not by itself, right? It's in conjunction with a bunch of other reforms. But this, I think, sheds light on the problem. You can ban a particular practice, but this question of does that mean it'll actually be still used or not used is a question of what happens and how it gets implemented. When you have a ban, well, is it effective? A lot of that depends upon, well, what happens when you roll out the ban? And how do officers understand the ban? How do officers understand the regulation? How do officers understand this rule? And does it actually change officer behavior? One of the reasons I say that I'm a skeptic of training is the nature of training in the United States, the nature of training police officers in the United States. So in much of the rest of the country, specifically, much of the rest of the world, specifically the parts of the world that we in the United States like to compare ourselves to, the developed countries of Western and Northern Europe and Central Europe, countries in East Asia, Australia. In many of these countries, police officers have years of training, extensive training. In the United States, it's usually, it really varies because the United States is also unusual in the world, where in the United States there are 18,000 or so law enforcement agencies. So you can count that in different ways, but you get the idea. There are thousands and thousands of law enforcement agencies. And generally speaking, each of these law enforcement agencies have their own rules, have their own regulations, have their own standards for hiring and standards for training. So while many police departments, the kind of police departments that you're probably thinking of, the large police departments, the New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, have large academies with that. They have huge groups of officers coming through and going through that academy. So there's a very specific and regulated kind of training. Even there, the training is usually in the order of weeks or months, as opposed to, again, the years of training that we see in much of the rest of the world. And you might ask, what happens during those weeks or months of training in the academy? And if you look to see what the actual content, what time is spent on, the vast majority of the time spent in the academy is related to firearms usage, is related on proper handling of firearms, is related to memorizing laws and memorizing rules. And you say, okay, all that sounds fine, and it is, right? Of course, we expect officers to be able to know the law, and we expect officers to be able to use the weapons that we provide to them. But very little of that training is devoted to the kinds of things that we might be concerned about. Constitutional violations, ethical obligations, when force becomes unlawful, when force becomes excessive, questions about biased policing or prejudiced policing, questions about sensitivity towards different racial, ethnic groups, different religious groups, being aware of how to deal with diverse populations. Very little time is spent in the academy on those things. So you might say, well, shouldn't we just increase the amount of attention that's spent on those things? And you can. But again, it's difficult when there are so many different police departments around the country with such radically different standards to attempt to implement that. That's not the way the United States has tended to approach policing. We don't have a federal police force in the way that many countries do. We don't have centralization of authority in the way that many other countries do. It's much more dispersed. We leave it up to police departments. We leave it up to local law enforcement agencies, sheriff's departments, counties, cities to make their own rules. And so it's almost impossible to come down and say, this is the rule and this is what the training is going to look like. And inevitably, when small departments, especially small departments, are faced with budget crunches and this question about, well, where's the money going to go? I don't know any police department would say, we only have a certain amount of money, so we're going to cut the amount of time that we're spending on firearms training and spend more time on ethical policing or concerns about biased policing. We can also look to see how these regulations and how these laws kind of live in practice. I was working on a case in the South, and I was looking at a sheriff's department, a rural sheriff's department in the South, and I was looking over their policy book, right? The book of their procedures that they give to all of their sheriff's deputies. And it was, it's kind of funny to look at because it had been clearly this kind of Frankenstein's monster of policies that have been added on to, there was Rule 1, Rule 1.2, Rule 1.2a, and there's photocopies, and this thing had kind of grown over time. And when asked, when sheriff's deputies were asked, well, what do you do with this policy? They say, well, we're given it the first day we're hired, and we put it in a desk, and we never really look at it again, which is troubling. But beyond that, when I actually did a kind of content analysis of this policy and procedures book, what I found was that there were 9 pages related to firearm certification. There were 5 pages or whatever related to canines, related to dogs. There was a paragraph about biased policing. There was a sentence about excessive force. So you can say you're passing these rules, you can say you're implementing these policies, and that's fine. But what does it actually look like? And how do officers actually understand it? Because if you say this is the rule, and then it gets put in a binder and put in a drawer and never looked at again, then you have to wonder, you have to ask, how much teeth does that rule really have? Beyond that, there's this kind of common cliche that I've heard so many times. I can't trace down who originally said it because I think it's kind of said everywhere. And that is when an officer completes the academy, right? So when they complete the academy and they become an officer and they're a new officer, in most places, not everywhere, but in most places, officers have some kind of probationary period where they're assigned a field training officer who's going to now show them the ropes. And this is usually some crusty veteran, right? Some old veteran who's been around, who's been on the force for years and years and years. And they're going to guide this young officer and show them the ropes. And the saying, the cliche, is forget everything you've learned in the academy. That stuff will get you killed. Here's how you really be police. So you have everything that gets shoved down officers' throats in the academy, everything that gets shoved in their binders, everything they get presented with. But when they actually are on the job and learning on the job how to really be a police officer, then, forget all that. That's the stuff that's going to get you killed. This is what you do. Which also really limits the ability of police departments to make meaningful reforms. When you look to see what's actually covered in police academy training and what's actually covered in this field training with the veteran officer, so much of it is dominated by stories, by these horror stories, these cautionary tales about an officer who wasn't safe, about an officer who wasn't looking where they were going, about an officer who didn't have their gun drawn and was killed. So even though policing is clearly a dangerous profession, I mean, it is, it's almost as dangerous as being a trash collector or a road worker, right? There are many dangerous professions in the United States. But in law enforcement, you have this series of cautionary tales. Well, what's the effect of that? When you devote a huge amount of time to putting officers on edge and letting officers know they're surrounded by threats and danger. And then, on the other hand, in a throwaway line in one paragraph say, and you can't use chokeholds. Which message do you think is going to get heard? And if we looked at actual interviews with police officers, when police officers talk about their understanding of their policies, their understanding of their procedures, the thing that really sinks in is the danger, as opposed to the rules and regulations and prohibited behavior. Okay, so how about the second proposal? The second proposal is to require de-escalation. So de-escalation. So when an officer is engaged in force, when an officer is engaged in a situation, when there's a potential for a use of force, the officer, this proposal is that officers have to figure out ways of bringing down the tone, bringing down the temperature. And again, of course, this is a great idea. We want officers to be de-escalating situations. The question is, well, what happens in practice? And what happens in practice, a colleague of mine, what he likes to say, is that the very presence of police, the way that policing works in the United States, is escalating. from how they're dressed, to how they carry themselves, to how they're armed and equipped. Their very presence escalates the situation. You look to George Floyd's killing recently, and one of the things that we see is that the videos keep coming out, and every time new video comes out, who knows, by the time you see this, maybe another video has come out, and it's going to kind of shed different light on the situation. But at least from what we understand now, that when the officer first approached Mr. Floyd in his car, he had his gun drawn. His gun was drawn immediately. Well, what does this do? This is automatically an escalating act. So if you're now calling for de-escalation, well, the cat's already out of the bag, right? The situation's been escalated. And so much of the way that police are trained and taught and acculturated for how to interact with citizens, walking with your hand on your gun, that is by nature escalating. So to ask for de-escalation is already after the fact, if we don't address the more fundamental issues first about how these police-citizen interactions begin and how they develop. The third proposal is to require warning before shooting, to say, I'm going to shoot, I'm going to fire, right? And here, of course, this proposal requiring warning before firing carries with it the proviso that when realistic, when possible. Obviously, so often when a police officer pulls their weapon or uses their weapon, situations are happening quickly, situations are happening fast. And an officer, if you recall, the Supreme Court jurisprudence that governs use of force and excessive force, the case Graham versus Connor, talks about whether the police officer has a reasonable fear, right? Reasonable fear for their own safety or safety of others. Well, when you've trained officers and raised officers and acculturated officers to perceive situations with fear, right? To perceive all situations as bearing the real potential and immediate risk of death or serious injury, even though, and again, I want to be really clear, obviously, we want to minimize any dangers to officers. We want to minimize threats to officers. But being a police officer in the United States, aside from what are some high-profile anecdotal cases of officers being killed, which of course are tragic, being a police officer in the United States right now is relatively safe historically. Right? We don't see police officers dying and experiencing life-threatening injuries at nearly the levels that we did, say, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And yet officers are still being raised in the same idea where there's a constant threat to your safety, a constant danger, which again escalates situations. So to require a warning shot, well, if an officer really feels that their life is a danger, if the person is a threat, well, then they're going to fire, and they're going to fire quickly. Maybe, and the reason why I'm skeptical of this reform is that I don't see a court. I don't see any court in the United States really second-guessing that police officer's decision. If the officer says, no, I was afraid for my safety or I was afraid for my life, there's a reason why the vast majority of uses of force are upheld and said to be good. There's a reason why very few police officers are ever indicted. There's a huge degree of deference that is granted to police officers in their assessments, in their judgments about danger. And so to require a warning shot, well, what's going to happen if the warning shot isn't given? Right? If the warning isn't given before the shot is fired. Well, it's one of these things where you can have a rule, but in practice, it's going to be a rule that never really has any weight. The fourth proposal is that police officers are required to exhaust alternatives. And again, exhaust any alternatives before lethal force is used. And again, what I would say is this is unrealistic in practice. But also, and this is what's, I think, again, a point that's worth noting, is that frequently these deaths that we've paid attention to, right, these high-profile deaths, I mean, some of them have been police-involved shootings. Many of them have. But many of them have not involved lethal force. many of them have involved what we would refer to as non-lethal force as one of these alternatives that was being exhausted, right? One of these alternatives along of saying, like, well, we could have done this instead, right? George Floyd was not shot. He was held down. Eric Floyd was not shot. He was in a stranglehold. Freddie Gray was not shot, right? These were non-lethal uses of force. These were the alternatives, and the alternatives are still resulting in people's death. So then the question you might ask is, well, then why is this an issue, right? If sometimes accidents happen, clearly they weren't intending to kill them, right? They were using the non-lethal force, right? There's this question of intent. Well, one of the things that's really disturbing as far as these non-lethal applications of force is concerned are perceptions that officers have by race. And this is a perception that is not just limited to officers. This is a perception that is kind of widely found in society, in American society. And some of these perceptions are kind of strange. So what do I mean? Well, for example, in study after study, respondents suggest that African Americans have a higher tolerance for pain. Okay, that doctors and nurses are more likely to discount complaints from African American patients that they're experiencing pain. So if you believe that African Americans, specifically if you have these ideas about African American men, that they're able to withstand huge amounts of pain, then even when you're using the non-lethal force, might that non-lethal force be applied more severely than is necessary? Or might you not listen or not take into account what the African American subject is saying things like, I can't breathe? Might you ignore that plea, thinking, oh, they're just faking it, they really can, because we all know African Americans can tolerate huge amounts of pain? And whether this rises to the level of conscious bias, or whether this kind of stays below the surface as some kind of implicit bias, is worth debating, and that's certainly something we'd want to understand. But what we do know is that in study after study, there are sometimes these kind of strange attributions that are given to African Americans, such as supernatural abilities. This is kind of the weirdest one I remember reading was, do you believe that, showing a picture of an African American, do you believe this person has psychic abilities? And people were more likely to say yes. Do you believe this person can fly? More likely to say yes. Right? So there's all kinds of weird ideas that many people have, whether consciously or subconsciously, whether explicitly or implicitly. A lot of these views are widely held in American society, and there's no reason for us to believe that police aren't as vulnerable to these often distorted understandings as any of us are. We know that doctors are subject to it, nurses are subject to it. Why would police officers be any different? Fifth, the fifth proposal is to require a duty to intervene. And this is, again, another example, I think, of something that makes complete sense. And the intuitive appeal of it is obvious, that police officers, if you are a police officer responding to a call and you see another officer using excessive force, so Officer A is using excessive force, then you, Officer B, should be required to intervene, to intercede on behalf of the subject, on behalf of the citizen, on behalf of the civilian, right? To stop the excessive force, the unlawful force, the force that is no longer required or is more than is needed. It seems like a great idea. So, first question I would have is, well, let's look at George Floyd. The Minneapolis Police Department had gone through extensive reforms and extensive reevaluations of its use of force policies and its training programs in the years leading up to George Floyd's death. All of the officers involved in George Floyd's death had gone through this training, and all of them were aware of a duty to intervene. that when force was no longer required or when force was excessive or unlawful, it was their duty. They had an explicit duty to stop the officer who was using that force. Well, what do you see? Well, you've all seen the video, I'm assuming. Or if you haven't, you've heard of the case. You had one officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck, and the other officers either assisting or standing by. So even though every officer knew of their duty to intervene, none of them acted upon it. So how much do we expect this duty to actually, be effective at changing officer behavior? Right? This is obviously just one case. We don't know. Right? But if you look to how this duty actually lives, and I've looked at the use of force policies in the 100 largest police departments in the United States, which make up millions and millions of people. When you look at those policies, these duties vary widely, but all of them are filled with these kind of, for lack of a better word, lawyer speak. Right? They're filled with a lot of these provisos and exceptions. They say you have a duty to intervene when it's reasonable, when it's realistic that it would actually stop the use of the excessive force from being implemented. There's wide variability in whether the force is unlawful or excessive or illegal, or whether the force is no longer required. And this wide variability and this use of these legal terms like reasonable or unreasonable means that, what does reasonable force look like? What does unreasonable force look like? If you look at actual scholarship, we see wide variability when police scholars have attempted to define reasonable force or have attempted to define unreasonable force. And if police scholars can't agree on what unreasonable or reasonable force is, then should we really be expecting the 23-year-old rookie to know what reasonable force is or unreasonable force is? So can we really expect them to actually intervene? And what happens if there's a power differential? What happens if you're the rookie, you're the 23-year-old, right? And your partner, who's a 45-year-old, who you look up to, who is your role model, if he's the one using the force, are you going to stop him? Are you going to intervene? Are you going to tackle him? We also might look at what's happened when officers have attempted to intervene. A very famous case of Carol Horn in Buffalo. This was years ago now, but Carol Horn was a police officer in Buffalo, 17-year veteran in the Buffalo Police Department. She was responding to a call, and the officer that she was responding with was using excessive force. She recognized the officer was using excessive force. She attempted to stop the officer from using excessive force. The officer punched her. Carol Horn lost teeth, had her jaw wired shut. So we say, okay, well, that officer is clearly out of the line. What happened? Carol Horn's the one who got fired. She's the one who got fired. The officer who intervened is the one who got fired. The officer who used the force, his job was protected. His job was secure. Carol Horn was fired. The police union did not support her. The police union did not represent her. And the city attempted to strip her pension. So there's this question also about, well, what's really going to happen? Right? There's this bond of loyalty that is understandable in policing. When you're riding along with another officer, you need to know that you can count on them and they can count on you. Right? That loyalty is understandable. But the question is, if you have a duty to intervene, is that duty to intervene going to be strong enough to overcome the bond of loyalty to your other officer? And if all it is tacked on to existing dynamics within police departments, there's very little, there's lots of reasons, I believe, to be skeptical of whether it will actually be effective at changing officer behavior. Sixth, to ban shooting at moving vehicles. This is a fantastic idea. I have no complaints about this. This is just legitimately a great idea. The Los Angeles Police Department did this a few years ago. This is a very good idea. You should not fire at moving vehicles. And you might ask, well, why shouldn't you fire at moving vehicles? Well, Because what happens what's the goal here, right? I mean, if you can shoot at the tires, then good for you. But there's a huge risk of injuring innocent bystanders. There's a huge risk of hitting the driver. Now the vehicle's out of control, right? So there's lots of reasons why it's a really bad idea to fire at moving vehicles, and I fully support this. I think that's just a good idea. 7, to implement a use of force continuum. And this would be kind of like a formula, right? When A happens, then you can use your taser. When B happens, then you can use the club. When C happens, then you can draw your firearm. And to have this continuum where there's this very formulaic flow chart, logic chart of when officers are allowed to use each escalating weapon. And you can kind of, maybe by now you can kind of foresee what my complaint is going to be. Well, what happens when you actually try to implement this, right? When situations are changing fluidly and changing rapidly. Like, do you honestly expect police officers to be fired when if they skipped a step? Do you expect police officers to be punished because they jumped a step, right? That's not the way these interactions occur. These interactions are not like, well, I move, then you move, then I move. This isn't chess, right? Where there's like these long deliberations. Often they're very fast. They're very, very quick. I've in other videos I've talked about how I've read the hundreds of pages of testimony of Darren Wilson's grand jury. His grand jury testimony regarding the death of Michael Brown. These hundreds and hundreds of pages, right, of trying to account for what was ultimately a situation that was resolved in a matter of minutes, right? From the period when, the car was first pulled over to when Michael Brown was dead was a very short period of time. That these situations happen very, very quickly. And to expect an officer to say, okay, now I can do this, or, oh, I have to wait, now I can do this. On the one hand, I would say that that's going to put officers' health and safety at risk, right? And there's a reason why officers are going to be opposed to it. And if they're opposed to it, if they think a rule is dumb, if they think a rule is going to make them unsafe, then how likely are they to follow it? And how likely are police departments really to carry it out? But beyond that, it's also just unreasonable. That's not the way these situations tend to evolve. They're much more dynamic. They're much more fast-paced. And finally, of the 8 can't wait, number 8 is comprehensive reporting. And that would be reporting of all uses of force, reporting of any time there's excessive force or an allegation of excessive force, any time a firearm is drawn, any time a firearm is discharged. I think this is also a fantastic idea. So, is there a pattern here for the ideas that I think are good versus the ideas that I think are unrealistic? Well, the ideas that I think are good are ideas that are very clear, black and white, right? Where there's no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, and ones that have clear, demonstrated policy effectiveness and really can be implemented, right, without a lot of concerns about how it'll be interpreted and how officers will actually carry it out, right? A duty to intervene, well, what's realistic? What's reasonable? What's excessive? There's so many judgments there. Versus you draw your gun, you fill out paperwork, right? That's pretty clear. That's pretty transparent. That's pretty easy to implement. I'll throw a bonus one in there, one that's not covered by the 8 can't wait, but is pretty popular, and that's the use of body cameras. So body cameras were something that it's funny. It's within my career as a policing scholar that they've emerged onto the scene, and very quickly became dominant. They very quickly became the most studied thing, the most implemented thing, the widest reform. And when body cams were first proposed, police departments were very opposed to them. In a way that police departments are, like any organization, opposed to outside people coming in telling them what to do. I mean, in that way, police departments are no different from any other job, right? No one likes someone coming in and telling them what to do, or no one likes someone coming in and changing the rules all of a sudden. But police officers were very suspicious of body cameras initially, because this idea, well, you're just going to be watching my every move. You're just going to be looking for me to screw up, right? This idea that I'm going to be constantly I'm going to be in a fishbowl where people are constantly going to be trying to evaluate every action. And that response that police officers had at the time actually mirrored a lot of ways the response to dash cams, to dashboard cams, when they were first implemented a few decades ago. Well, if you look at dashboard cams, police officers now are very on board with dashboard cams and very supportive of dashboard cams, because they understand how they can be used as evidence at trial and how they can be used to clear them and to support them when there's ambiguities or questions about what actually happened. Well, in the same way, body cameras were initially opposed, but have since then largely been embraced. And what I would say about body cameras is, are they a good idea? Maybe. I think it's always a good idea to have more evidence. It's always a good idea to have another perspective. But there's a lot of problems with body cameras. And one of the problems with body cameras, at least the way they've been implemented so far, is that they can be turned off. They can be blocked. They can be moved, right? Maybe if we had a floating drone 10 feet above the scene that captured a kind of a God's eye view of the scene, that would be okay. But the problem with body cameras is that they're only from one perspective. And because they're only from one perspective, they can often miss a lot. If an officer's turned away and facing this way, then you can't necessarily see who the officer's pointing to, right? So body cameras in implementation have actually proven to be kind of mixed in terms of how effective they are at really clearing up these cases. And if you want a good example of it, again, look at George Floyd. We had the cell phone camera, then there's the body cameras, then there are more body cameras, and each time more evidence was introduced, it didn't clear things up, right? The people who thought that the use of force was appropriate, well, after they saw the new footage, they still thought it was appropriate, right? It's generally speaking not changing a lot of people's minds. It's generally speaking not really answering things. Maybe sometimes it would. If you look at the kind of videos that have been really effective, for example, the killing of Walter Scott in South Carolina, there you had the police officer and Walter Scott all in the same shot, and the citizen who was recording them was some distance away, so they had a good field of view and they could see everything that had happened. Or again, the most famous camera footage, still to this day, that of the beating of Rodney King. Again, this distance shot where you have this entire scene being captured with no problems about perspective or point of view. Those kinds of camera footage have been very, very effective, but oftentimes the kind of shaky body camera footage is not nearly as effective. So what's the problem? Right? Why? So even though I imagine some of you might say, what's the downside to implementing these things? Right? Even if they're not perfect, aren't they still? Isn't the perfect the enemy of the good? Aren't they good enough? Won't they make things better? And I would say, initially, the first thing to keep in mind is this is a moment in time, and this is a moment where there's a huge amount of political capital and political will to address these long-standing issues in policing. And if you implement these kind of piecemeal reforms that aren't really that effective, well, a couple things are going to happen. One, you're going to use up your moment. And who knows when that moment would come again. Right? If all that gets implemented are some more training programs and some more regulations and rules that the veteran officer tells the rookie to ignore, then we haven't really changed anything about policing. And the other side is, well, what happens when these programs then get implemented and aren't effective and don't actually reduce these uses of lethal force? Well, then people become cynical. Then people believe that policing just can't be fixed. Or they think that these reforms are pointless and we should just let police do whatever they're going to do. Or on the other hand, you have citizens who become cynical, who then turn against the police. So is there a way out, right? I mean, I don't want to be fatalistic about this, right? Is there any possibility? Well, one possibility is what's referred to as police abolitionism. And this would be calling for abolishing police departments and saying no more police. And I don't want to mischaracterize this. I don't want to, cast this in intentionally a negative light, because I think I know many people who are police abolitionists, and I think they're very intelligent. I think they're very smart. I think they have a perspective, a point of view. But what I think is more useful is to think of police abolitionism as a critique. In the way that Alex Vitale in his book The End of Policing puts it, is imagine all the things that police officers do on a daily basis. Well, we know what they do, right? People, if you've ever been on a ride along, you know what they do, right? And also people have studied police officers and police officers' behavior during the day, how they actually spend their time. The vast majority of police officers spend most of their time on what are referred to as calls for service. So these are responding to neighbor complaints, a barking dog, loud music. He keeps leaving his stuff on my lawn. These are not crimes. These are police officers coming in trying to resolve situations, resolve conflicts that are not criminal conflicts, but are interpersonal conflicts. Or businesses complaining about the homeless person who's sleeping in front of their business and blocking the door, right? Or the drunk person who's stumbling down the street. So what Vitale asks, and what many police abolitionists ask, is take all those things that police officers do, and for each thing that a police officer does, ask, could someone else do that instead? And if you find, maybe a social worker would be better at handling that situation. Maybe a homeless services outreach worker would be better at handling that situation. Maybe a mental health professional would be better at handling that situation. Maybe a family therapist would be better at handling that situation. And as you start to assign these tasks to other people, the world of policing starts to shrink. And what Vitale suggests is maybe at some point it will shrink and then there'll be something left. And that thing that's left, that only the police can do, is what police should be doing. Responding to people who are violent, who have guns, who are hurting people, dealing with gangs, dealing with bank robbers, solving murders. These are things that we wouldn't expect social workers to do. These are things that we wouldn't expect homeless services outreach people to do. These are things that we would expect to send someone who's heavily armed, who has armor. Those are the people we send. You send those people to deal with those kinds of situations. And in that way, policing shrinks. Maybe it shrinks in terms of money, and this is where the phrase defund the police comes from. Maybe we give the police less money because we're giving more money to other agencies, social service agencies, other community service agencies. But maybe it also shrinks in terms of the number of tasks we're expecting police to really carry out. One of the things I always tell my students is I believe that the job that we ask police to do is impossible. As much as I'm a skeptic of police reform, and as much as I might be critical of policing and the way that policing is carried out in the United States, I'm not going to blame the 23-year-old rookie who wants to help his community. I'm not going to blame the officer who wants to make a difference. If there's going to be blame, I think the blame should go on us, who expect the police to fix everything, who sit back while social services budgets have been slashed, while mental health outreach has been slashed. I think we should take some of that blame and say, where are our priorities? And we should take some of that blame when we say, did we really need to call the police just because that guy was kind of weirding us out? Did we really need to call the police just because our neighbor was being kind of loud? Did we really need to call the police because that dog was barking? Are there other ways that we can handle these kinds of situations without bringing in someone who has such extensive firearms training and use of force training, without bringing in someone whose presence will be escalating? So this idea of defund the police, well, I'm sure there are some people who literally are saying defund the police. Most people I know who use that phrase, and most police scholars I know who talk about that, are talking about it in terms not of getting rid of the police department, but by rethinking what we expect the police to do. And one of the upshots is, well, if you send out social workers who are not carrying guns to deal with these situations, that there's really no risk of anyone getting hurt. The neighbor complaint about the noise, the dog barking. Well, you're also going to get a lot fewer instances, probably, of use of force. Think back to George Floyd. His predicate crime, his underlying crime, was using a fake 20. Might there be another way we could have handled that situation? Or Eric Garner, who's selling loose cigarettes, so therefore the crime wasn't paying the sales tax, the tax evasion? Did force need to be used there? Is that the way we need to be approaching the situations? Might we find another way of approaching them instead? And could, by reducing the number of encounters and reducing the amount of exposure people have towards the police, might we in fact be saving people's lives? Thanks for watching. If you like this video and like to watch others, I post a number of other videos about crime and policing and law. Subscribe and you can get updates when I post new ones. If you have a question that you'd like me to answer during office hours, post in the comments and maybe I'll answer it.